But Alex, the Cypriot press, and I mean, you've been covering how the European press has been talking about EU military unification, but this is another example of it.
Here we have Elias Hazou, who writes for one of the two main English language Cyprus titles, Cyprus being, of course, a sovereign country with some strings attached and being an EU member state and a core member, in fact. People may remember Patrick Henningson's coverage of the savings crisis, where the banks helped themselves to people's savings. Cyprus has had it hard, and of course, nearly half of the island, the northern part, is occupied by Turkey. Severe security challenges. There's sovereign base areas operated by the British military and GCHQ in the south and east, Aya Nikolaos and Akrotiri. And the French want to get their hands on this stuff now. So Hazou has picked all of this up, and he, as the first mainstream journalist, whether in English or in the national language, the first mainstream journalist, to my mind, in any EU member state, including Britain, who has actually gone to the nub of the matter and asked, what is PESCO and how does it relate to our sovereignty? And to give him his due, he did his research and found that the UK column was the best information available. So he quotes at length there, people can freeze it or find the article themselves, none other than David Ellis and your good self and myself as well at some points, and gives us full credit. And he's told us that he thinks there's nothing rivaling UK column's coverage of EU military union in the whole of Europe, which we don't like to boast about, but I'm afraid it's true because very few other people are bothering to look.
Excellent, and we're going to thank the Cyprus Mail.
And Alex, over the last couple of days, we've been highlighting how the British press has been giving Russia such a hard time and blame suggestions of Russia pumping fake news into the country, and as we covered on the programme yesterday, suggestions that Russia is in control of many campaigns, including the including people that are questioning the use of vaccinations, the broad use of vaccinations. But here the Dutch Interior Minister also warning of Russian fake news.
Yes, Kajsa Ollongren. People might think she sounds Russian, but I believe it's a Swedish name by origin. But she's doing a carbon copy of the British government as the new Interior Ministry, and she represents the Bien-Pensant Liberal Party, D66, which is very anti-traditional and quite elitist, really. She has said that Russia is involved in fake news, and the turns of phrase, as often happens, are identical between the British and Dutch governments.
And let's mention Dilyana Gutniera. I probably haven't pronounced that correctly, but of course, Dilyana was exposing the transfer of weapons into Syria and other places and lost her job as a result. Although I believe the articles that she wrote haven't actually been taken down from the media company she was working for. So she's a freelancer again, but getting some coverage.
Yes, her articles, I believe, are still at trud.bg, trud.bg, but this is quite a shift of gear. Radio France Internationale, which is the public broadcaster for the world, it's the equivalent of BBC World Service or Voice of America or Deutsche Welle, they have actually covered her properly. And this, to me, because there's such a close alignment between these state broadcasters for overseas consumptions and the government, it implies to me again that the Élysée, the French presidential palace, has directed the French deep state to do an about face and distance itself somewhat from the Anglo-Saxon and NATO arrangements, particularly in that same area that we were just talking about, the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean, because of course the nub of this is that Bulgaria was shipping its former Soviet and current production runs of munitions allegedly ultimately to terrorists in Dilyana's reporting, but via stopovers in countries like Turkey and Pakistan, ultimately destined for Syria and Afghanistan and for Central Africa and Southern Africa. So it's quite unprecedented, I think, that the French would have reported this at, shall we say, official or almost state level, and does indicate that the French are not on the same page as us.
Now, this is some propaganda that the Foreign Office has pushed out today on Yemen. It says in 2015, a Houthi rebel insurgency overthrew the legitimate government of Yemen, except that it didn't, because there was no legitimate government of Yemen. At the time, President Hadi, who had been the president, had overstayed his welcome by a year. His term had ended on 25th of February 2014. He remained in office until 2015. And he failed to call for a general presidential election as per an agreement that he had signed. So that the propaganda that the government has pushed out said that it triggered the Saudi-led coalition to intervene at the request of President Hadi. But as we say, as we've just pointed out, President Hadi had no legitimacy. So this isn't an insurgency in the sense of some terrorist rebels here, or even moderate rebels, if you want to put it that way. This is people getting rid of somebody that had overstayed their democratic mandate. And so the propaganda goes on. Today, Yemen is one of the most serious humanitarian crises. Well, indeed it is. UN estimates 77% of the population needs humanitarian aid, and 20 million people face extreme food shortages. No mention of cholera, but don't worry, because Britain is leading diplomatic efforts to end the crisis, including bringing together key stakeholders. And who's the key stakeholder? Do you see any Yemenis in that picture,
Well,
Brian?
you wouldn't want them involved.
No,
it's just like you don't want the British public involved in Brexit negotiations.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me introduce you to the Quint, if that's how it's pronounced. This is the foreign ministers of the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Oman, Secretary of State for Political Affairs from the United States, and the UN Special Envoy. So again, nobody from Yemen represented. Well, what did Boris Johnson have to say? The UK is hosting this important forum on Yemen because it's vital we redouble efforts to work towards a sustainable political solution to the conflict. Since the beginning of the crisis, the UK has played a leading role in diplomatic efforts and will continue to do so. The people who are suffering most from this conflict are the people of Yemen, again, not represented at that table. This is the world's worst humanitarian crisis and largest ever cholera outbreak. The UK is the fourth largest humanitarian donor to Yemen, but it's probably the largest donor to Saudi Arabia's arms and munitions cash, which it is currently dropping on Yemen. And of course, Saudi Arabia blocking the ports and airports and preventing humanitarian aid from getting in at the minute. So once again, Boris Johnson demonstrates a level of hypocrisy that is almost impossible to put into words.
Yep.
Right, but slightly more serious news now, this is the Globe and Mail. NATO Research Centre is a headline. NATO Research Centre sets sights on Canadian website over pro-Russian disinformation. They say in an upscale condo in the Old Montreal, owned by retired University of Ottawa professor, sits the headquarters of a website that is now in the sights of NATO's Strategic Communications Centre of Excellence, as it investigates, among other things, the online spread of pro-Russia propaganda and disinformation that props up the regime of President Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The website globalresearch.ca is ostensibly the online arm of the Centre for Research and Globalisation, which has the trappings of a think tank and styles some of its regular contributors as senior fellows. But it is the media that matters. Its online content and its amplification on social media form the core of its activities. The site has disseminated articles that claimed that Assad regime was not behind the April chemical weapons attack that drew a punitive US missile strike, also suggesting it was a hoax and that the deadly nerve agent sarin was not used. But what once appeared to be a relatively harmless online refuge for conspiracy theorists is now seen by NATO's information warfare specialists as a link in a concerted effort to undermine the credibility of mainstream Western media, as well as the North American and European public's trust in government and public institutions. Global research is viewed by NATO's Strategic Communications Centre of Excellence, or STRATCOM, as playing a key accelerant role in helping popularize articles with little basis in fact that also happen to fit the narratives being pushed by the Kremlin in particular and the Assad regime. So what do you think of that?
I think that the powers that be, the global powers, are extremely frightened of the truth coming out in any form that it comes out. And if it's been global research that's been telling the truth, particularly about those key questions of chemical weapons use by Assad, they're very, very worried. We're going to see a bit more of this later in the news with what's happening in defence.
Absolutely. So the STRATCOM, or whatever it's called, this little think tank research organisation, isn't actually part of the command and control structure of NATO. It feeds, it's maybe you might describe it as an intelligence gathering and an analysis centre, and it feeds information into NATO. But what about the Globe and Mail themselves? Well, good news, Brian, because they have joined the Trust Project, right? Which means that we can trust what they say, and everything they've said about global research must be true because they've joined the Trust Project. Just to remind you what that is, this is all about news with integrity, and this is becoming a kind of cartel of mainstream media who feel that they need to get together and try to do something about the disinformation that's being pushed out by all the alternative media sites that are being funded by Mr. Putin.
Governments need to be held to account, and the only people to do it are us, and by that I don't mean UK column, I mean it is the public at large. It has to be a great number of people starting to take the right action to bring individuals to account. And Vanessa, you've just taken us through the horrors of Syria. Of course, another conflict stirred up with the help of the British government, including financing. But of course, it's the British government standing on the world stage and lecturing other nations about how they conduct their individual affairs and their countries. I want to bring our viewers today back on the subject of this amazing lady, the Beechwood Children's Home whistleblower Melanie Shaw. I've labelled this one vulnerable woman who must be crushed. It has become obvious that the British state, led of course by Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May, wants this child abuse survivor utterly crushed. On screen we've got people who were either involved in putting her in prison or stood by and did nothing so that she subsequently went to prison. And Melanie Shaw has now been in prison for some 18 months. I think we're approaching 18 months. She's been through a series of secret trials, public not present, journalists not present. Indeed, several occasions she wasn't even allowed into court, but had to give her evidence by video Skype link, which mysteriously failed at key moments. The British government, led by Theresa May, of course a Conservative, desperate to silence this lady because of what she knows about politicians abusing children, particularly in the Nottingham area, but also with links UK-wide. And it seems to us the agenda is to keep her in prison while the child abuse inquiry, if we believe that is taking place, but while that takes place. So where is Melanie at the moment? Well, she's been moved into this prison, HM prison style. This is a particularly unpleasant prison. It's very antiquated. It was a Victorian's orphanage. I think there's some irony in that, Mike. And what has been going on in this prison? Well, we're going to tell you, but before we get into the meat of it, let's have a look at what the state agents have been saying. This gentleman, Luke Sargent, is the Deputy Director of Custody Women's Estate. So he's the man apparently in charge of standards in women's prisons. He's had this to say with respect to Melanie. I can, however, give you assurance that Miss Shaw is being treated in accordance with prison rules and that she's being cared for in a safe and decent environment appropriate to her needs. Well, the reality is, the brutal reality is that Melanie Shaw has been kept in a nightie, making her fearful and vulnerable in the presence of sexual predatory inmates. She's been denied soap, basic toiletries. Mail has been withheld. She has no money. She's denied educational activities. In fact, she's denied all activities. And she remains on what's called a 3-man lockdown. This is where they may be men, they can be all men, excuse me, but warders, men and women, 3 of them follow her wherever she goes, to the toilet or to the shower. This is degrading treatment. This is Theresa May's Conservative Britain, which is lecturing President Assad on how to run his country. But have a look at what the prison governor has or hasn't done. Now, we have become aware that Melanie Shaw has not been told of the offences with which she's charged, nor has she been given her release date. And this is in direct contradiction to prison rules, which ensure that these key pieces of information are known by all prisoners, usually determined upon first arrival at the prison. Now, this has not happened. The lady on screen is the governor of HM Prison Style, Mahala McGuffey, and we know that at the moment Melanie Shaw is in prison. She has no idea of the charges against her. She has no idea of the release date, and we say that psychological torture, aside from the brutal regime she's being subjected to. It is very clear that Melanie Shaw is being singled out amongst other prisoners for this treatment, and there can only be one answer, Mike. The state is terrified of the knowledge that Melanie Shaw has. This is her own words. I've been allowed one shower in 2 weeks. I have no toiletries. I have a cast iron bed in an empty room. I had no fluids again today. A warder tried to stop the nurse dispensing my medication. It's like something from a concentration camp. Well, I do hope that today we've got viewers from overseas. I do hope that we've got viewers from Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, for example, Iraq, because while the British government is lecturing you on how to run your internal affairs, this is the reality of Britain. And I'll just end this segment by putting up a picture of what I've called the privatised gulag. This is Britain's prison system, or at least part of it. We have to remember, of course, that Britain's prisons are now being used to make profit for big business. This is pretty sick stuff, Mike, I think.
The hypocrisy is amazing, Vanessa.
I mean, it's actually mind-blowing. You know, one of the, and again, it's not about me, but one of the mainstay smears that they used against me leading up to the Geneva conference and even after the conference. So again, they didn't address the white helmets, but they went back to default position smear, which of course is we're pro-Assadist, we're pro-Russian, but also back to this torture concept that I'm endorsing, torture inside Syria, etc. And you know, what I've said all along, we in the West have absolutely no right to any sort of moral superiority over any other country in this world. Torture should be condemned at all levels, but actually if you look at the top 3 or even the top 4, I would put the US, the UK, Israel and Saudi Arabia up there. And so, you know, if any nation conducting torture both domestically and internationally should be accused and prosecuted and investigated and condemned, it is our own country, whether we're in the US or we're in the UK, because equally they support client states who are violating humanitarian law on every level in Saudi Arabia and in Israel. I mean, let's look what's happening in Yemen. The United Arab Emirates are conducting mass torture in the south of Yemen under the guardianship of the Saudi coalition, but of course that includes the US and the UK.
Yeah,
extraordinary.
Absolutely. Well, look, Alex Thompson's in the chat box and he's just said that France should be number 5 on that list. Well, that brings us very neatly into this because the Telegraph reporting here that Macron has announced a new EU plan to launch what's quoted as being concrete military action to rescue African migrants enslaved in Libya. Now, why is Libya in a state where African migrants could possibly be enslaved? Brian, could that be anything to do with the US, Britain and France? I think it probably has.
Proximity to Syria.
Well, but the key point is we destroyed the country in the first place. So this is why. Yes, sorry, Vanessa.
Yeah, but I think also we have to be very, very careful, as I'm sure you're aware, of this entire sudden explosion of the slavery issue in Libya. I think it's purely another excuse for further intervention and military escalation inside Libya. Why? Because, you know, Egypt now is breaking ranks. It's basically it's starting to go against Israel. It's saying now that it is not supporting the movement of Palestinians from Gaza, for example, into the Sinai, which of course is again in direct contradiction to the Israeli agenda against Gaza. It is showing support for Syria. It's accepting trade partnerships with Russia. So I think we're seeing potentially a military buildup in Libya on the back of this slavery story, which of course is being promulgated by the usual suspects, the usual NGOs, the usual media, in order to try and, I think, to sort of secure Egypt and to lock down on any sort of revolutions within the ranks and support of what I call the peace bloc, which of course is Syria, Russia, Iran, China, and now even Turkey is being brought in. So we're seeing a lot of maneuvering going on here, and so I don't think this is a genuine exposure of the slave issue inside Libya, because, as you said, we created it, and it's been going on for a lot longer than something that's just blown up now.
Absolutely right. We did create it, and what's more, we're profiting out of it. It's, as I said before, it's the same business model as for the drugs trade. So you're right about that, everything you've said, but it goes a little bit further because, of course, this announcement has been made on the day that the European Union, the African Union, are launching a joint. This is actually going to be a joint military and policing action. It goes hand in hand with this big conference that's going on between the EU and the African Union at the moment. But it doesn't just end there, because if we go to The Guardian, we find that Blackwater is now pitching a plan to get involved in this with a privatized police force. So what we're saying is European Union common defence policy action, now being the African Union being brought into that as well. So we're seeing the expansion of the EU southwards, and now we're seeing private interests getting involved in this as well. Brian, this is hugely dangerous.
It's immensely dangerous. What we're dealing, Mike, with psychopaths. We can now see that the key politicians, they're the front end puppets who are driving the policy. We're dealing with sociopaths and psychopaths. There can be no doubt about that. But of course, what do we need to focus on? We need to focus on the big money people who are pulling the strings of the politicians. We've got to deal with both issues, the politics and the money power that allows this globalist political agenda to advance so quickly. This is fear, but I'm going to bring in this man. Here we go. Let's get to the heart of it. Tim Fortescue, Conservative whip, said to BBC Camera that when the dirty little politicians who've been abusing little boys came to the Tory whips, it was covered up so that the members would do as they were asked. This is blackmail, Mike.
Yeah.
Is it any wonder that we see Tory politicians too scared to speak out? Remember that, Melanie Shaw is suffering in that cell. This is what it's all about. Heath, child abuse, the engine of Westminster. And I think we'll end on that note. Vanessa, any closing remarks that you'd like to bring in?
No, I would just like to say that Guy Metton, who took such a principled and courageous stand in order to maintain free speech, liberty of expression at the Geneva Press Club, is still coming under serious attack, having allowed the event to go ahead. So please, would people write to the Geneva Press Club? You can find the email address very easily online. And please write in support of him. This man deserves it. Imagine if this event had successfully been cancelled. Imagine how that would have emboldened both the NATO-aligned media, but not only that, the terrorists inside Syria, the terrorists that are outside Syria that we know about. So he took an incredibly important stand for all of us, and he gave courage to other people that might have sort of dithered over taking such a stand. So please, please, please do everything you can. Write to him, email him, send him chocolates, send him flowers, whatever you want to do. But please just simply show appreciation for somebody that stood by his principles.
Vanessa, thank you very much. Very good advice there. And I'm going to say that is exactly the advice for people who say, what can they do for Melanie Shaw? The answer is write those letters. When Robert Greene was in prison, he was receiving thousands of letters a week. That was the boost to him, and he's done so much work since. If you want to support Melanie Shaw, write her those letters, because those letters are the lifeline to her while she's incarcerated in Theresa May's gulag.